Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at bitesizedbiographies.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of part one of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Ira Hayes and the flag raisers of Iwo Jima. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Bite-Sized Biographies. Follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige, and please note that all of Bite-Sized Biographies are now available on Spotify. And please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies. Now let's get started with our story about Ira Hayes and Iwo Jima. On February 19, 1945, the U.S. Marine Corps landed on the island of Iwo Jima. This tiny enclave, only 8 square miles in size, was heavily fortified and defended by over 22,000 Imperial Japanese troops, dug in an intricate system of underground tunnels, pillboxes, and caves. Although 600 miles from the Japanese mainland, Iwo Jima was considered Japanese territory and would be defended accordingly. The most prominent feature on the island is a 550-foot hill located in the southwest corner known as Mount Suribachi, which rises prominently from what is mostly flat terrain. Because this elevated area provided Japanese artillery with a commanding view of the U.S. landing beaches, the mount's capture was the first objective of the American military. Following a preliminary 3-day bombardment from a flotilla of supporting naval forces, the first waves of Marines began an amphibious assault at 9 o'clock in the morning. Reconnaissance of the landing area indicated terrain suitable for such an endeavor, but the island's surface of soft volcanic ash instead of sand complicated access by vehicle and made digging foxholes for cover impossible. Initially, for the first hour of the assault, the Japanese defense deliberately withheld fire to allow American troops and material to concentrate on the beach, understanding that it would be difficult for this force to quickly move anywhere. This plan of action was implemented by the Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, who had spent the previous 6 months developing strategies and fortifications to maximize defensive strength, inducing extreme casualties. Beginning with machine guns and mortars and following up with heavy artillery, the defenders turned the landing zones into a quagmire of death and destruction. Wreckage and dead bodies everywhere, beginning at the water's edge. Soldiers fled the immobilized motorized vehicles that were supposed to transport them inland and took to trying to ford the soft volcanic ash on foot, their plight made difficult by the undulating 15-foot-tall crests that made getting traction difficult. Survivors later stated that evading bullets and shrapnel was like attempting to dodge raindrops in a heavy storm. At least one positive was that the impact and concussive force of artillery and mortar shells was alleviated by the soft ash surface. While much of the U.S. assault group's focus was the airfield in the central part of the island, and ultimately the bulk of Japanese defenders concentrated in the northern sector, Mount Suribachi remained another primary objective. Despite heavy casualties, the 28th Regiment of the 5th Marine Division, at the conclusion of Day 1, was able to complete the first part of its mission, completely crossing the narrow 700 yards to the other side of the island and severing any connection between the defenders on the hilltop with other Japanese military on the island. The beachhead was also secured, despite the defenders' attempts to halt the invasion in its tracks. some U.S. troops even able to secure a small part of the island airstrip. But these positives were offset by casualty figures that were staggering. Over 550 Marines killed in action, more than 1,750 wounded, numbers approximating close to 50% of the entire human cost of Guadalcanal. Although darkness did bring some relief from the relentless defensive response, experienced soldiers anticipated an equally terrifying banzai charge, waves of Japanese soldiers attempting to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers, despite incurring massive casualties themselves. But no such attacks came, Korebayashi deeming such tactics as a pointless waste of his precious defenders. Instead, throughout this night and the course of the entire battle, small groups of Japanese attempted to infiltrate U.S. foxholes and campsites, quietly picking off and bayoneting exhausted or unsuspecting GIs until the morning of Tuesday, February 20th. Because the enemy was situated in tunnels, heavily fortified structures, and caves, it was impossible to observe exactly where and how many defenders stood in the way of the 28th Regiment on Day 2, as it attempted to secure the base of Suribachi. Landing on a strip of beach that ran only 400 yards from the hill itself, the regiment, unable to receive support from tanks that were stuck in the landing zone, made progress yards at a time. Gradually, the attackers realized that the Japanese were not just in front of them, but beneath them. Frequently, a pillbox or blockhouse would be neutralized, GIs moving beyond the now seemingly benign structures, only to then take fire from the rear, the defensive positions replenished via the tunnels that ran throughout the island. The structures themselves frequently required grenades and flamethrowers applied from point-blank range, requiring access at a terrible human cost. At the conclusion of Day 2, the 28th was still 200 yards short of the base of the mountain. The final assault against Suribachi itself occurred on Wednesday, February 21st, over an elevated slope with absolutely no cover, a 7-story interior maze of specially situated artillery and machine gun emplacements designed to originate an impregnable killing field, manned by 2,000 defenders determined to fight to the death. Again, hoping for tanks, the regiment commander, Harry Liversedge, delayed what appeared to be, without armor, a suicidal frontal assault. Following a preliminary aerial attack and naval artillery barrage, at 8:30 a.m., Brigadier General Liversedge issued the order to advance. What followed was the individual heroism and collective effort that was typical during Iwo Jima, a conflict resulting in more Medals of Honor, 27, than any other U.S. military engagement. Eventually, coordinating with continued aircraft carrier plane aerial assaults, naval bombardments, and tanks which eventually did arrive, despite frightful casualties, the 28th subdued the mountain defenders who were no longer able to provide the type of lethal response that characterized the initial stages of the assault. Day 4 consisted of mopping up isolated Japanese, grenades and flamethrowers trained on caves, and whatever sporadic resistance that was encountered. The Japanese prognosis became so desperate that at dusk, approximately 150 soldiers attempted a breakout through Marine lines in an attempt to reach the northern side of the island, a maneuver that resulted in the death of most of these individuals. This practically unheard-of Japanese abandonment and retreat from a fortified position indicated that the relentless infantry, aerial, and naval assault on Suribachi was inflicting a withering result. By nightfall, Liversedge received his assignment for Day 5, seize the exterior top of the mountain itself. On February 23rd, another aerial assault on Suribachi started the day with bombs and napalm lighting up the mountain. Liversedge assigned Colonel Chandler Johnson the task of an initial reconnaissance of the summit. So depleted were the various platoons under Johnson's command that he mixed and matched 40 soldiers from separate units. First Lieutenant George Schreier was designated as this group's commanding officer, and before he began the ascent, Johnson gave him something else, an American flag stored in the colonel's map case. His final words were, If you get to the top, put it up. With little else happening in the vicinity, men on the beaches, at the base of the mountain, and even using binoculars on ships offshore began to follow the ant-like progress of the patrol as it laboriously made its ascent. Most observers presumed that it was only a matter of time before the column met at least some major resistance, if not total destruction. But the Japanese remained in their internal positions, unaware that the morning's bombardment was over. The patrol's progress was tedious. At each cave entrance, several grenades were tossed inside, the group picking its way single file along blasted rock without even a trail, crawling on all fours much of the time. As they got higher, the men started to fan out to provide support to fend off the attack they were sure was imminent. But as they approached the rim of the hill's crater, not a shot was fired. The ascent took about 40 minutes, the group looking into the mass of destroyed Japanese equipment and debris within the crater and looking back toward the shoreline and the beachhead where they started days earlier, a majestic view. Lieutenant Schreier had his orders, so the immediate task in front of the patrol was to figure out how to mount the flag on the summit of the hill. Japanese water drainage pipes were scattered in the rubble near the summit, and an appropriately long cylinder was eventually located, the flag quickly tied to one end. 4 ranking soldiers, Schreier, Sergeant Ernest Thomas, Sergeant Henry Hansen, and Corporal Charles Lindbergh, then physically planted the flag, jamming it into the rubble, while other soldiers, including Medical Corpsman James Doc Bradley, Private Phil Ward, and Private Raymond Jacobs, gathered rocks and held the flag in place as it was buffeted by a stiff wind. An official Marine combat photographer named Lou Lowry documented much of the ascent and the flag held by some of these soldiers only seconds after it was put in place. Although small, the flag was clearly visible to all American military personnel in the vicinity, including those offshore, a spontaneous cheer rising up accompanied by the fleet's foghorns, sights and sounds that all of those present remembered as thrilling and unforgettable. This pandemonium also summoned the unwanted attention of a small group of defenders lodged deep within caves near the top of the crater. Perhaps initially unaware of the American patrol, they sporadically emerged, tossing grenades in the direction of the small U.S. cluster of soldiers. They were met with rifle fire, grenades tossed back into cave openings, and Charles Lindbergh directing his flamethrower into any aperture that might contain a potential attacker. Lou Lowry was in the vicinity of a tossed Japanese grenade that forced him to hurl himself over the rim of the crater, sending him tumbling several yards down the rocky incline. He suffered lacerations and a broken camera, but his film remained intact. This was the most serious injury to the patrol, and order was quickly restored at the top of the mountain. Back at Chandler Johnson's headquarters at the base of Suribachi, the colonel decided that the patrol at the top could use a wired connection for their field telephone, the batteries currently operating the device on the verge of running out. He designated 4 men from the 2nd Platoon, Harlan Block, Mike Strank, Franklin Sousley, and Ira Hayes, to head up to the crater, unspooling a dedicated wire to improve Schreier's communications link. At the same time, Johnson also had another soldier find a larger flag to replace the barely visible stars and stripes that currently was in place. It was also his intent to retrieve the smaller flag as a souvenir. A new flag, 8 feet by about 4.5 feet, was quickly retrieved from one of the landing craft on the beach. Johnson gave it and additional radio batteries to 19-year-old René Gagnon, the battalion's runner and messenger, and told him to head up the side of the mountain with the 2nd Platoon group, have Schreier put up the larger flag, and retrieve the smaller flag for the colonel. At the same time, other personnel were heading to the top of the crater. A civilian photographer for the Associated Press named Joe Rosenthal and 2 Marine photographers, Bob Campbell and Bill Janoust, were intent on trying to get photos and film of the patrol at the Suribachi summit. On the way up, they ran into Joe Lowry, who told them that he had photographed the first flag raising. They almost decided to head back down, but Lowry encouraged them, telling them that the view was incredible and that they might get some worthwhile pictures. They got to the top only minutes after the 5 soldiers, new flag and wire in tow, arrived at the peak. Lieutenant Schreier ordered the 4 newly arrived Marines to take care of raising the flag. Most of the other soldiers present were milling about, not paying much attention to the imminent second flag raising. This effort was perceived as more of a detail. The real excitement had been over the initial symbolism of hoisting the first flag, signaling the conquest of Suribachi. Private Ira Hayes and Private Franklin Sousley quickly found another steel water pipe that was suitably large enough to attach the flag. All 3 of the photographers were aware that another flag was about to be raised and were trying to anticipate a decent angle when the action suddenly came together. The steel pipe weighed over 100 pounds, and Mike Strank asked some of the other Marines to help, 2 quickly jumping into position, and the group of 6 men began to move forward, Block in front jamming the pipe into the ground as Hayes pushed the pipe from the rear, the flag immediately whipping taut in the stiff wind. As the pipe straightened, all 6 gathered around and pushed it further into the ground. Rosenthal and Janoust almost missed their opportunity. Not wanting to get in each other's way, they were distracted. Janoust clicking on his movie camera an instant after the group started to raise the flag. Rosenthal only had time to squeeze off 1 photo and was not even sure if he got anything of value. Campbell was quite happy with his shots. From a different perspective, he was able to photograph the first flag being removed while the second one waved behind it. Rosenthal figured he might want to guarantee getting something of value, so he subsequently got as many Marines as he could pose, almost 20 in all, with the flag behind them. He figured that shot had a much better chance of publication. But it would be days before he knew anything more, his film transported by plane away from the theater of combat to the safety of a photography lab on the island of Guam. It was not a given that Rosenthal's film would even be developed. Guam was 1,000 miles from Iwo Jima, so this film cartridge and many others might be lost or tossed out before it even made it there. Rosenthal's cartridge of 12 exposures did make it to Guam, and to one of the many technicians who routinely developed such film. The last 2 shots were ruined, overexposed, but the 10th frame was usable, and it was immediately earmarked for further scrutiny. An AP editor quickly became excited by the photo's potential and sent it via radio photo, a crude fax machine-like device, to AP headquarters in New York, arriving approximately 7 a.m. Eastern Time, Sunday, February 25th. From there, it was disseminated to hundreds of newspapers all over the country and published less than 18 hours after Rosenthal had snapped the photo. It appeared nationwide, including on the front page of the New York Times above the fold. The 6 Marines raising the flag over Suribachi caused a sensation, both within the world of journalism, but also among the public as well. Never mind that this was not the initial flag raising. This wasn't even widely known at the time. Never mind that the battle was far from over. The photo captured a profound feeling of national pride and patriotism, an answer to the fundamental question, what are we fighting for? It also resonated at the very top of the U.S. government. From Franklin D. Roosevelt's perspective, Rosenthal's photo could not have appeared at a more opportune time. The shocking casualty numbers from Iwo Jima, not only before the photo was taken, but in the ensuing weeks of the as-of-yet unconcluded battle, the financial and societal costs of the war, and the prospect that the Pacific Campaign might continue to drag on for years, including a lengthy invasion of the Japanese mainland itself, was beginning to wear on the American people. Additionally, because the war was not funded by taxes, but by bonds purchased by the public, and with a 7th national war bond drive imminent, the government needed to shore up and rejuvenate enthusiasm, ensuring that the American people would remain committed to supporting, especially financially, the war effort. In the instantly iconic Rosenthal photo, FDR decided that he had a suitable vehicle to help maintain such fervor. On March 30th, he personally ordered Marine leadership in the Pacific to locate and return to the U.S., the 6 flag-raising heroes of Iwo Jima. In retrospect, this might have seemed to be a relatively simple task, but the battle itself had officially ended only 4 days earlier. Men who were atop Mount Suribachi close to a month before were now scattered all over the northern portion of the island, where the final Japanese resistance was wiped out. Some were not even alive, killed in action only days afterwards in the savage fighting that marked the costliest U.S. engagement in the Pacific theater. But the identity of the company that supplied most of the flag raisers was well known, and Marine top brass was able to identify René Gagnon as at least a witness to the scene on top of Mount Suribachi. When shown a copy of the second flag raising and asked about the identity of the participants, Gagnon initially identified himself, Franklin Sousley, Mike Strank, John Bradley, and Henry Hansen. Although he definitely knew the identity of the 6th participant, he deliberately omitted this soldier's name, Ira Hayes. Rumors of the official search for the flag raisers were prevalent, and Hayes did not want to be forced to leave his unit and his Marine buddies for special attention. Having witnessed the death and destruction of some of his closest friends and comrades in ways that were brutally horrifying, Hayes felt that receiving singular attention for merely appearing in a photograph was disrespectful to those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Hayes went so far as to threaten Gagnon personally if he ever identified him as one of the flag raisers. Such an attitude might seem unusually strident, but Ira Hayes was an unusual American well before he ever enlisted in the Marines. Ira Hamilton Hayes was born on January 12, 1923, in Secaucus, Arizona. Secaucus is the capital of the Gila River Indian Reservation, home to the Gila River Indian community, comprised of both Akabel Udum, also known as Pima, and Pipash, also known as Maricopa Native American tribes. Both of Ira's parents, Joseph, Joby, and Nancy Hayes, were full-blooded Akimel Udum who lived on the reservation. Their anglicized names were the result of membership in a Christian church, in their case a Presbyterian church founded by an evangelist, Charles Cook, who in the late 19th century baptized more than 1,000 Akimel Udum and built churches throughout the reservation. Joby and Nancy probably attended one of several missionary schools that also were a part of the church's reservation profile. The couple married in 1922, Ira the first of 6 children. But life in this part of the world for Native Americans was very difficult. The Akimel Udum were historically an agricultural tribe in an area where water rights, with the eventual onslaught of white settlers, became contentious. Native Americans typically on the losing side of that dispute. 2 of Ira's siblings died before the age of 5. Joby barely scratched out a living, farming his own plot of land, picking cotton and chopping weeds, an existence that was similar to most of his neighbors. Although his children, as they grew older, were expected to help with farming-related chores, they were also sent to school, first to the missionary elementary schools, and then in Ira's case at age 17 to the Phoenix Indian boarding school. While on paper further education might seem to be a positive step for a 17-year-old, the Phoenix Indian boarding school was one of many institutions operating nationwide in the early 20th century, designed to implement the Americanization of Native Americans, an attempt to mainstream tribal members into typical American society. Hayes's boarding school removed him from his family and the reservation, adopted a militaristic style including the wearing of uniforms and martial attitudes and behaviors, forbade any language other than English, and provided mostly vocational training for both males and females. Ira stayed at the Phoenix boarding school for 2 years. In May of 1942, he left to join the Civilian Conservation Corps Indian Division, also known as the CCC/ID, a special expansion of the CCC in recognition of the dreadful Depression-era economic conditions on native reservations. By then, American participation in World War II was in full swing. Federal employment agencies like the CCC/ID were heavily involved in recruiting for the military, and it was only 2 months before Ira made the decision to join the Marines. Although he needed his parents' blessing and signature, by the late summer of 1942, Ira was undergoing the 7-week Marine ritual of boot camp near San Diego. Not surprisingly, there were numerous other Native Americans involved in this training. Harsh conditions and extreme poverty back in the reservation made serving in the Marines during wartime practically attractive by comparison. Historically, Native Americans have served at 5 times the national average of other ethnicities. Hayes received the predictably rigorous physical conditioning, weapons training in which he qualified as a sharpshooter, and most of all the inculcation of what it meant to be a U.S. Marine, perhaps boot camp's most impactful outcome. No slouch, Ira, after successfully completing his 7 weeks, then requested parachute training. Marine parachutists were an elite group trained specifically to operate behind enemy lines in situations that were extremely hazardous. Almost half of the original group of applicants did not make it, but on November 30th, 1942, Hayes successfully earned his wings and was promoted to private first class. After a brief leave in which Hayes returned to visit with his family, he shipped out to the South Pacific. Initially stationed in New Caledonia, Ira and his unit were moved northward, Marines bonding under the unified adjustment to a harsh environment, institutional food, and lack of taken-for-granted American staples. The U.S. military was preparing for an attack on Bougainville, a strategically crucial part of the Solomon Island chain. Hayes' 2nd Parachute Battalion would take part in a diversionary raid on Choiseul Island, adjacent to Bougainville Island, and a reinforcement of the troops who initially invaded Bougainville itself. In December of 1944, Hayes' 3rd Parachute Battalion would be sent to the front lines, where Ira would experience the brutal ferocity and oppressive environment of the Pacific Theater for the first time. In dense jungle, humid hot temperatures, and inscrutable terrain, his unit continuously patrolled a 1,000-foot ridge line that exposed them to ambush and attack at any time. Japanese patrols were active in the same area, firefights and casualties a frequent occurrence. The 3rd was then ordered to dig in and establish a perimeter front line, requiring 2 soldiers in a muddy, collapsing foxhole, amidst a steady tropical downpour. On the very first night of this ordeal, Hayes was sharing his fortification with another soldier with the unlikely name of William Faulkner. With Faulkner asleep, a Japanese soldier, hoping to catch GIs off guard, leapt into the foxhole in the middle of the night, intent on killing any occupants. Hayes was on guard, wide awake, and Faulkner woke up to the sight and sounds of Hayes bayoneting their attacker. Wanting to avoid any potential other hostile rifle fire, the 2 soldiers then pushed the dead Japanese out of their foxhole, blood pooling with the water at the bottom of their dirt enclosure, a harrowing situation. Neither dared doze off for the rest of the night. Hayes' Company K was then ordered to retrieve the bodies of Americans killed in recent fighting in the vicinity of their location. These bodies left behind when U.S. forces had to retreat in the face of a Japanese advance. Completing this task involved hauling back already putrefying remains with stretchers or even GI ponchos. Before retreating themselves, the Japanese had horribly mutilated these soldiers, adding an additionally terrifying aspect to this ordeal, which the company successfully completed. Shortly thereafter, the unit was ordered back to the rear. This was the last service Hayes would undertake on Bougainville Island. His 3rd Parachute Battalion was disbanded and then reformed within the 5th Marine Division and transported back to Camp Pendleton, San Diego, in preparation for the assault on Iwo Jima, the attack on this Japanese outpost already in the planning stages. In fact, aerial and naval bombardment of Iwo Jima was already underway by the end of 1944. Understanding that an assault of Iwo Jima would be quite costly, that it was actually a tiny speck far from the Japanese mainland and could potentially be bypassed, the U.S. military high command felt that the assault would provide several fundamental benefits. Iwo Jima did have an airstrip that allowed Japanese fighters to intercept bombing missions headed for Japan, as well as the ability to warn the mainland of such incoming bombing raids well in advance. A successful invasion would eliminate this obstacle. B-29 superfortresses were currently embarking from bases in the Marianas. Damaged planes were lost without any other closer landing strip available in the event of an emergency. These landing strips would also eventually provide a staging area for the fighter escorts that could accompany B-29s for the entirety of any future bombing raids, as well as the raids involved in a potential mainland invasion. Iwo Jima literally meant Sulphur Island, the element mined by a few civilians on the small 8-square-mile outpost. Once the Japanese military determined that a U.S. invasion was probable, they assigned the defense of Iwo Jima to General Tadamichi Korebayashi. Korebayashi, like one of his Japanese counterparts, Admiral Isiroko Yamamoto, had studied and traveled extensively in the U.S. He had great respect for his American adversaries and was philosophically opposed to Japan's attack on the United States, believing that the country's industrial might would eventually wear down Japan's limited infrastructure. But upon receiving his June 1944 appointment as the commander of Iwo Jima's defense, he began to formulate and implement a strategy to exact the maximum amount of American casualties, in the hope that such a costly battle might force the U.S. military to reconsider an invasion of the mainland. Privately, to his wife, he confessed that his new appointment was a suicidal endeavor, and that most likely at the battle's conclusion, not even his ashes would be found. Nevertheless, Korebayashi immediately evacuated any sulfur-mining civilians, allowing him maximum latitude to transform the island into a network of tunnels, caves, bunkers, pillboxes, and blockhouses. As the U.S. invasion force approached the island at the end of February 1945, Iwo Jima had been transformed into a bristling fortress equipped with some of Japan's most powerful armaments. Troops concealed in naturally fortified positions exactly as Korebayashi envisioned at the beginning of his tenure. The American High Command, with over 70,000 troops slated to take part in the initial amphibious attack, estimated that completely overrunning the island and its defenders would take only 5 days. This wildly optimistic appraisal did not incorporate the suicidal determination of the island's 22,000 Japanese soldiers or the skill and resolve of their commander. Ira Hayes came ashore as a member of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marine Regiment, in the third wave of amphibious landing craft to hit the beach. Artillery and machine gun fire intensified as he approached the landing zone, so much so that he and his fellow Marines got as close to the deck as possible. Jumping off the ramp, he was immediately confronted with bodies along the shoreline, but instinct forced him to keep moving forward. In his first 2 hours on the beach, he advanced about 75 yards. By all accounts, the landing at Iwo Jima, even for hardened veterans of similar incursions, involved an unprecedented level of carnage. Soldiers were forced to witness their comrades alive 1 second, the next cut in half, body parts, limbs, and corpses strewn everywhere within the beach's vicinity. Like some of the rest of the members of his regiment, Hayes eventually successfully traversed the distance across the island, cutting off Mount Suribachi. Despite this initial success, Ira and the 28th were still about 1,300 yards from the base of the mountain. The second day of the battle was spent tightening the circle around the base of Suribachi. Hayes was part of this action, and in the vicinity of Private First Class Donald J. Rule, a Marine who had already distinguished himself on day one by single-handedly neutralizing Japanese bunkers, retrieving and carrying severely wounded men out of harm's way, jeopardizing himself in the process, and spending the first night 75 yards ahead of his unit's position, occupying an abandoned Japanese machine gun emplacement to ensure that it was not reoccupied. On day 2, he and Sergeant Henry Hank Hansen from Ira Hayes' platoon crept up to the vicinity of an enemy bunker when a grenade landed between the two soldiers. Without hesitation, Rule leapt on the device, absorbing its explosion but killing him instantly. Hansen and several other GIs were spared death or severe injury. For this and other acts of courage on Iwo Jima, Rule became the first Marine awarded the Medal of Honor. Such sacrifice was common, these efforts allowing the 28th to encircle and neutralize the mountain after only 4 days. Initially, Hayes spent Day 5 patrolling the base of Suribachi, intent on mopping up any remaining Japanese combatants. It was during this time period that Ira saw the first flag, which he later described as small and difficult to see, go up. At the conclusion of his unit's patrol, Hayes returned to a temporary headquarters for a brief respite. He was then selected by another unit sergeant, Mike Strank, to accompany Strank, Franklin Sousley, and Harlan Block to unspool a reel of telephone wire to connect the HQ with the commanding officer, now situated on top of Mount Suribachi. This group was accompanied by E Company's messenger, Rene Gagnon, with orders to replace the smaller flag with a larger version of the Stars and Stripes. Hayes said later that the group expected to run into some hostilities on the way up to the summit, but the group made it without firing a shot, the Japanese still fearing additional naval and aerial bombardment. Immediately, Ira and Franklin Sousley were ordered to find something appropriate to use as a flagpole. Hayes spotted a water pipe amidst the hilltop's rubble, and both men quickly pulled it out of the ground. While Gagnon was preoccupied with furling up the smaller flag, which he was ordered to return, the others, including Hayes, Block, Strank, and Sousley, attached the second flag and quickly had it ready to be raised. They asked a couple of the other bystanders who were involved in the first patrol to reach the top to help them lift the heavy improvised flagpole, and within seconds the banner was placed in the ground and secured with a pile of rocks and ropes. They were completely unaware of the 3 photographers who took pictures and even a short film of the second flag's installation. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast about Iwo Jima. Information for this podcast came from the books Flags of Our Fathers by James Bradley and Ira Hayes, The Akimel Udom Warrior, World War II, and The Price of Heroism by Tom Holm. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical and musical information at bitesizebiographies.com. Thank you for listening, and please tell a friend about Bite Size Biographies.